In this first episode of my Classes for Grasses video series, we are going to cover basic grass structure and anatomy. This will then give you the tools to understand the fundamentals of grass identification. Grasses. They can seem really difficult at first, and most of us, probably if we admit it, avoid at all costs having to identify them. But actually, if you can learn some of the basic ones, it'll free you up and you'll realise just how much you can find out about a habitat with what grasses are there and how to manage it better also. So for example, here where I'm sitting, we've got so many different species just in this one patch, and this is simply where they've let a bit of amenity grassland grow along, so it's not complex species, and that's where I would recommend you start really. Go somewhere that hasn't got very many species, that are more the sort of common ones. So we've got, for example, false oak grass here, which is definitely one that you'll see absolutely everywhere. We've got Yorkshire fog down at the front here, again very characteristic, one that you can easily get your eye in. Other species that we've got here, we've got cocksfoot, again another easily recognisable one. But the best way is to learn some of these simpler species, and it'll give you confidence to be able to do the others. One of the things that you'll notice in some of the books when you're trying to read them, this is one of my choices by the way, because it has a whole section on keying out grasses, and essentially learning to be able to use the key is almost like a magic superpower, because once you know how to use a key, you can pretty much identify anything. Sometimes the keys can seem really scary because they start throwing words at you and you're just like, what? I don't understand. Which bit is a gloom and which bit is a lemma and what's the spikelet and the floret and all of these different words. So really, we almost kind of need to learn a new language in order to be able to do it. And I know that can seem really scary, but actually it's only a few words that we really need to know and get cemented in our minds. Things like being able to know that sometimes they refer to the stem of the grass as the culm. The fact that the leaves are sometimes just called the blades. The fact that the joint where the leaf meets the stem has a really important feature called a ligule, which is like a sort of bit of membrane that pokes up from where the join of the leaf is to the main stem. And the shape, the length, how hairy or whatever this ligule is can be one of the key features that tells us what grass that we're going to be looking at. So it's really good to get familiar and get looking at all the different ligules that exist. Another thing that they often talk about is the leaf sheath, which is essentially the bit where the leaf almost wraps around the stem before it then juts out at an angle and becomes the main leaf blade. With grass flowers, we're often talking about very small parts of the grass. Here on false oak grass it is slightly bigger, and I'm going to use an actual example of one that's been made almost sort of super sized so that I can show you. But here, if we look at this one, you wouldn't even think of a grass as having flowers, but every single bit of this top here has flowers all the way along it. We refer to the grass flowers as an inflorescence, and it also gets us to know what kind of inflorescence it is, and there are lots of different types. As you can see, grasses inflorescences come in all shapes and sizes, and these are all just taken from my garden. We've got a species like cocksfoot here, soft brome, Yorkshire fog. These are both Yorkshire fog, and you see this is before it opens out into this, so you could think that this has got a different type of flower to this one, but it's actually the same. We've got crested dog's tail here. We've got false oak grass, yellow oak grass, we've got rough meadow grass, red fescue and barren brome. Now most of these are the type of inflorescence that we would call a panicle, where it's all spreading out because the spikelets are on fairly longish pedicels or stalks, or even
branched into further pedicels or stalked as they go along. So most of these we would say are panicles, including these ones which are very sort of almost compact, and it would describe that when talking about it. Some of them do open up more, especially if you take gravity into effect, but generally speaking they're more compact panicles rather than these spreading ones. But as you can see, we said with the Yorkshire fog it starts off fairly compact and then spreads out. We've also got, just to bring into the mix here, another really common species here, and this is perennial ryegrass, which is what a lot of lawns are made out of. Now this is what we would call a spike, not a panicle, and that's because the individual spikelets are actually directly joined onto the sort of the stem. So you can actually see here that they don't have any pedicels at all. Now you can often get ones like this one, which would be also crested dog's tail described as a spike, because when you fold it out and look, you can't really see any pedicels either, but they're all over to one side as well, so that's something interesting. So it could be described as a spike or maybe spike-like. Equally, things like the cocksfoot, again, it's quite compact over to one side, so it could be described as a spike-like panicle. You could describe this, the crested dog's tail, or something like timothy grass or meadow foxtail, as being a spike-like panicle or even a raceme. One of the first things, as I've mentioned, that you really need to get to grips with in order to understand how to work out what grasses you've got, from the books that is you need to know what all the different parts are called. So I'm really lucky in that I've got a local floral recorder who's already made a few props that I can borrow. So a couple of props here to start with that are really useful, that can show you the differences in imagine this is the stem of the grass in the middle here, the culm, and how basically the leaf sheath is arranged on the stem. So sometimes in the books they get you to say, is it an enclosed or a closed leaf sheath, or is it an open leaf sheath? So you can see here that this leaf sheath, which comes all the way around the outside, is all joined up to the top. So that's a closed one. And you can see here that this one is more open and overlapping like this. So this is an open leaf sheath. The other thing that these are really good for is, you remember we were talking about the features where the main leaf blade joins the stem, the thing called a ligule. So on this one, if we move the sort of cut off leaf blade, as you can see here, we've got the membranous ligule, and on this one we've even got the auricles, which are these little projections that come either side. Auricles coming from the word auricular, or ear basically. And then on this one, if we fold it down, you can see that instead of a membranous ligule, we've got what is representing a ring of hairs. So that would be one of the main things that it gets you to look at. Especially in the beginning of keys, they'll often get you to look at that part. The other features that these little props show you is what would be described as the node, or sometimes if you're hearing a description about a grass, the knees of the grass, the sort of knobbly little sort of sections or joints on the stem. So this one's sort of smooth and this one's rough, because sometimes the fact that the node is hairy can be one of the distinguishing features, so it's worth checking those. Sometimes they're red coloured and that makes them look quite distinctive as well. Okay, so let's look at these grass parts again, but here using an example of a live wild oat grass as well as some of our props. So here, as we talked about, the stem of the grass where the flowers come off is known as the culm. And as we talked about, where the leaf comes off at that stem is really important, and so are the features on how it is. So if we bring in a couple of our props here to have a look, you can see that this one has been made to show that the leaf sheath, which is how the leaf wraps around the culm or the stem, how it actually is wrapped around. So here it's a bit like a coat with somebody sort of overlapping it, but it's not fused, it's quite still open. And And on this one, you can see that it's mostly the same. The other part to look at here is where the leaf blade meets the stem. So here we've got the ligule represented here by a nice sort of broad, fairly long membranous area of plant tissue. If we look on this real grass, you can see it's actually almost similar here. We've got this membranous flap here, which would be where the leaf blade joins there, and that's talking about the ligule. This false oak grass is a really good specimen to show you the ligule. So you can see that this is the main leaf blade, or just the leaf that comes away from the stem here. And as I pull it back, you can see that there's a transparent, almost like little bit that comes out from the bottom of the leaf blade just before it meets the stem, or the culm, which is the flowering stem. And that is the ligule. So sometimes you might want to measure it or compare it with another to see whether when they mean it's long or blunt. I mean, this one you would describe definitely as blunt, because if it was pointed, obviously it would come to a nice point. And sometimes they say that they're maybe toothed. One of the first steps in any of the flower keys, however, is to ask you whether the ligule is membranous, so this sort of translucent see-through bit, or whether it is simply consisting of just a ring of hairs. And that helps to divide out quite quickly one group of grasses from another, and it will take you to a different section. This one, as you can see, is talking about, instead of that membranous ligule, it's represented by a ring of hairs. So again, on this species we can double check, and as we saw before, this is a membranous ligule, not a ring of hairs. Sometimes it might describe something called auricles, which are these ear-like projections that come back from the point there, almost opposite where the leaf blade comes in. So these ear-like projections, or auricles, would be projecting out this way. This one doesn't have auricles. It could fool you into thinking that it does, because it's kind of got this wrinkly edge to the leaf here, but it could be just that my specimen has begun to dry, which is another point. It's really important to try and do this on a fresh specimen if possible, out in the field even better, because you can get information on its growth as well. Now, what I also have is an amazing prop here. I mean, some serious work has gone into this. And this is actually to represent the individual floret or flower of the grass, and this is the grass species false oak grass. Really, really common grass. Pretty much see it everywhere. I mean, I've got it in my garden everywhere. It's quite a tall, robust grass. And I think because it's so common, that's why we're using it as an example. So probably before I get into explaining the individual floret, we'll see how the flowers actually are usually found on the flower themselves. So a little bit less effort has gone into this, and a little bit more Blue Peter style, I would say. So we're imagining that this whole unit here is what you'd call a spikelet. So for example, on this grass species here, you can see that the whole thing, almost imagine, looks a bit like a Christmas tree. And each one of these little branches coming off has multiple spikelets coming off from a little stem there. And so we're imagining that this is one of these little individual spikelets. Okay? So in order to show you then how that breaks down into the flowers, first thing worth noticing is that you've got the glooms, which are actually at the base of the spikelet here. So here, the spikelet, at the base of it, which sometimes before it's flowering, they can actually completely enclose the whole spikelet, and as it matures they come out, are these two membranous sort of leaf type structures, if you will, called the glooms. And we've got a lower and an upper gloom depending on where it comes out from the pedicel, the stalk of the whole spikelet. And these glooms are often quite an important feature. It might be that they say that they persist, which means essentially once all the flowers of the florets have fallen out of the spikelet, then the glooms are still there remaining on the actual grass itself. Now obviously you can get spikelets that are really squished in and nice and compact like that. It's only that they're spread out, so I can show you. Some do spread out as they flower. Sometimes they're also what's called like laterally compressed, which means, so as well as I've squished them like that, it would be that they are squished that way, so they're flat along that side as well. To remind ourselves about the inflorescence, so the flowers of the grass. So this whole thing is the inflorescence. And then each one of these that's coming off here, this is a spikelet. So this is a spikelet, and this is a spikelet. So if we bring in our prop from before, our spikelet prop. So this whole thing that I'm holding, albeit made of felt and very brightly coloured, this is a spikelet. So it's representing one of these that's coming off here. In our NPMS guide, we don't tend to talk about florets. We only tend to talk about the spikelet. So again, when you're reading our guide and it's talking about what colour the spikelet is or what shape it is, then it's referring to this whole piece here. And if you remember, that's just one of these little bits branching off here, and that's this. The other thing that we mention in our NPMS guide is about the awns, which on here I've got them coming out the back of the lemmas basically, which is quite common. But if, for example, you're struggling with just the NPMS guide and you're finding that you can't quite work out what this one is and you really want to know, then you're probably going to have to get a different book out. And in those keys or in those descriptions, they will mention more detail than just the spikelet. They will definitely talk about ligules, and we do as well in our guide, but they will definitely start to ask you about what the individual florets are like and the lemmas and the glooms. And so it's really important that we know all of these things and it becomes second nature to us, so we don't have to look it up in the glossary every time and try and get our head back around that. So that's why I'm using these props as a way of showing you. We've then got the actual individual flowers for the grasses, or the florets. Now obviously not many are grey, black, blue and green. I've purely done that as a way of showing you the different items, the different parts of the spikelet. So you can see here that we've got the top floret here, which nicely comes out. So this is the individual grass flower. So when in the books they want you to look at the floret and look at the different parts of it, it's this one part of the spikelet that they want you to look at. Sometimes one of the things they'll want you to note is how many florets there are in the spikelet, and it varies hugely. I mean, some species it can say from 4 to 14 or something like that, but that again is counting these individual florets within the whole spikelet. The other thing that they can ask you sometimes is whether the lower florets sometimes are infertile, which means essentially if you were to pick it open and have a look, you're probably going to need your 10 or 20 times hand lens here to see whether it's got, you know, all the parts to make it fertile, so the ovary and things like that. And if it doesn't, then you'll know that that's an infertile floret. So we're wanting to find out just how many florets we've got in one of these spikelets. So if we take one of the spikelets off, just like that, lay our grass down for a minute. So now we're looking at it and we're wanting to just slightly tease it apart. You don't want to be too rough. Now, as I pull apart gently, we can see that there's these two fibrous bits here, and these are the glooms on the outside. And if we just gently wiggle, we can probably take it apart. So now we're left in this hand with the pair of glooms here, the slightly smaller one and the slightly bigger one. And that's the glooms. So you can look at any features that it describes on those. And then we're left with what we need to count now in terms of how many flowers. So you can see you've got two of almost identical looking things here. So these are both florets. So we have 2 florets, meaning that we have roughly 2 florets per spikelet. And you could do this with a couple of others to get the sort of average, but most of them I could see that there was 2. So on this species, once you've had a good look at it, you can work out that on most of these spikelets I can only find 2 florets within it, and it says in the book for this species 2 to 3 flowered. So what that would mean is instead of a spikelet comprised of 4 or more different florets, we could take these two ones away here, and essentially if we bend that back, our spikelets are looking a little bit more like this, with the 2 florets and then the 2 lower glooms. So here we've got another species here. This is sterile brome or barren brome, which actually is a really common plant, sort of weedy plant that you get by the side of roads or anywhere like that. So this is a really good one to show you what the actual spikelets are and how they can be made up of multiple flowers. So each one of these individual little items here on these pedicels here are spikelets. So if we take one off and just move our grass across, so this whole thing here, so this whole lovely beautiful thing here is a whole spikelet, and as you can see we're awns aplenty here. And again, so if we just loosely wiggle it about, you can see you've got the pair of glooms at the bottom that will be left on the pedicel after the flowers have dropped, if they do. So that's the glooms, and so we've got the smaller gloom and we've got the bigger gloom, and the bigger gloom's got this big long awn. So if we take that to one side, we're left with the individual florets. So you can see here, if we spread them out, looks like we've got four florets here per spikelet roughly, and you might find that some have more. Right, so now if we move on to talking about one of the individual florets, so if we remember, that would be the equivalent to me pulling this one out and saying, right, let's take a closer look at this guy, because this one's quite simple and basic. And we're scaling him up and we're looking at this one. And remember, this one is a specific species that's been made as a model. This is false oak grass. But this is like the bottommost floret, if you will, because we've got the glooms here. So we've got the bigger gloom, remember we talked about that, and we've got the smaller gloom here. The other bits that are sort of very gloom-like, you must admit, on the inside are called the lemma and the palea. So the lemma here is the one which has the awn coming out, and you can see that it comes from the back, from the midpoint. Now that can be a critical thing that you need to look out for, that it describes in the book. It will ask where the awn comes from. Is it joined all the way up to the tip and then coming up the top, or is it starting midway or all the way from the bottom? Those are sorts of things it's going to get you to look at. Okay, let's have a quick recap and look at some individual florets. You can see here we've got our glooms, these papery bits here. We've got the smaller gloom and we've got the bigger upper gloom there. And then here we've got, essentially this is a model of false oak grass. So we've got our sort of almost 2 flowers here, 2 florets. We've got the lemma here with the big awn and a little thin palea here, and then we've got a lemma here with the palea and the bisexual flower here. So one of the things in false oak grass is that one of the florets in it is male only, and one of them is female, so and male, bisexual. And you can see that these are the stigmas coming out of here. And here are the anthers on the male filaments here. And then inside are these little bulbous things called lodocules, but we don't need to worry about those for the sake of the kind of grass ID that we'll be doing on this series. The main things that you want to know are being able to know which are the glooms and being able to sort of recognise the different parts of them, and identifying the different parts about the lemma. And the palea is usually less significant, it's sort of a much more reduced scale-like feature, whereas the lemmas are often much more diagnostic. So that's one of the important things to know. Okay, let's go through what we have learned in this episode. We now know our inflorescence types. A lot of grasses are panicles, with branched pedicels with spikelets. Remember, these can open out over time. Examples of these include our false oak grass, rough meadowgrass and Yorkshire fog. Then we have the spikes, where the spikelets have no pedicel and arise directly off the central axis or stem, for example, the perennial ryegrass. Then we have the raceme and spike-like panicles. These are very similar and are often used interchangeably. However, technically, the spike-like panicle will have more than one spikelet and pedicel from the main stem, just like in a panicle, but be very short and close to the main stem, giving the spike-like appearance. Next, we looked at what a spikelet is and how the difference in size and shape can be important for identification. We now understand what the glooms are and how they are at the base of each spikelet, and these are also important features for identification. We looked at how a spikelet is actually made up of one or more grass flowers or florets, and how finding out how many florets can be crucial. The florets can then be looked at individually, but noted that this is usually only necessary for really learning the grass keys. Each floret is made up of a lemma and a palea, and that the lemma is normally where the awn is if the species has awns. Inside and between the lemma and palea is where you find the reproductive organs for the flower. Right, so that's it. Here's the list of botanical words you now know. Have a look through a plant ID book in the grasses section and see how much you can remember. Go out and try and look at the different features on some grasses. Just being able to identify the different anatomical features is already such a huge start. Our next episode will look at some of the usual suspects, both in terms of the common grass species and the species that appear in multiple fine NPMS habitats. We'll also cover some of the important features regarding growth habit. Thanks for watching and see you next time.